Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to our book talk with Michelle Duster. Michelle Duster is the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells, and we are featuring her book, Ida B., the Queen. And what's so great about this book is that the book is for all ages. It can be for kids, it can be for adults. It has fabulous illustrations. It's a quick read. The content is apropos to modern times, as well as drawing upon the historical significance and contributions of Ida B. Wells. And so I'd like to just introduce Miss Duster. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Wilmington Public Library virtually.
Thanks for having me, Jamar.
And so I'd like to just open up our conversation with this question. This is one quote that you see, everywhere when people mention Miss Wells. It even hangs high on the wall. And there's a restaurant named after Ida B. Wells called Ida B's. It's in Baltimore. It's a Southern cuisine restaurant, and they have this quote on the wall. And the quote says, and this is a quote that you see. It proliferates social media. It's her most famous quote. The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And so what I would like for you to do is just to tell us what were some of the wrongs that Miss Wells was trying to make right, and talk a little bit about her journey of shining the light of truth on them.
So my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, is well known as a journalist. She was a civil rights activist, a suffragist, a social worker. She was co-founder of the NAACP and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, the Alpha Suffrage Club, and the Negro Fellowship League. I mean, her resume is extensive, and some might find a little intimidating, which I did when I was a little kid. But what she was trying to shed the light of truth on was the fact that lynching was prevalent at her during her time, and lynching was a form of domestic terrorism. And she wanted people to know that. It was not a punishment for a crime, but many times it was a way to intimidate the Black community and to stop Black progress. And many times it targeted Black leaders and people who were successful. And she wanted people to know that is what the reality of lynching was.
And so, there's been numerous books written on Miss Wells. I mean, she had is it your grandmother that edited her autobiography? And then the acclaimed historian Paula Giddings wrote a book specifically talking about her work with anti-lynching. And so therefore, what I'd like to ask you, what does your work do that the previous works have not done? Tell us a unique contribution that you're making to this narrative of demystifying, Miss Ida B. Wells.
Right, well, there's several things that are different about Ida B. the Queen. And I was very intentional about making this book different, because there are so many other books that are written about her life. But this book not only gives an overview of her life and to give people a perspective of exactly what she was dealing with, the highlights of her life that were dramatic, and also to put her life into historical context of our 400-year history or experience of Black Americans in this country. People came before her who influenced her, and then there have been several generations after her in the 90 years that she's been gone. And I wanted people to see that continuum of Black resistance and Black presence and Black progress for the last 400 years.
Okay. Something that I thought that was really interesting, especially in her autobiography, is that she she wrote her autobiography, not just to write a story about herself, but she wrote her autobiography because she was discouraged that young people did not know the accomplishments of their ancestors. And this was what this was in the 1920s, I believe, when she wrote this. And she was upset that young people did not know the accomplishments that people of African descent made, during the Reconstruction era. And that was just an era of prosperity for us, where we were opening up banks, we were purchasing property, we were assuming elected offices, and so I just thought that was unique. Do you think that this younger generation, do you think that they you think that Miss Wells would feel that way today? Do you think young people are tuned to the contributions of their ancestors?
I think, Jamar, the way that history is taught in this country when it comes to the contributions and the experience of Black people is very surface level, and it tends to, this is how I view it. It goes from, there was slavery, which wasn't that bad, which is framed as not being that bad, because it skimmed over all the horrors of slavery are not delved into at all in any detail. And then after slavery ended, there was a Civil War, and then slavery ended. And then there was Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and then there was Barack Obama. And there's no, details about anything that happened in between those, centuries of time. And so I think we have a long way to go in our country to tell this numerous stories. I mean, Reconstruction is usually like one sentence in some textbooks, if it's mentioned at all. And then between World War I and, like I said, Barack Obama, it's just very skimmed over. I think we have a long way to go to help people understand the richness of our history.
Looking at the the Black Lives Matter movement, Will Smith said something that's very profound. He said, racism has never ceased. It's just now being filmed and recorded. And so, could you take that and kind of let's use that to kind of talk about the journalistic prowess of your great grandmother and the power of the press?
Right. Well, my great grandmother, Ida B. Wells, was a pioneer in data journalism. And luckily, she's getting credit for that these days. But what happened was that there was a lynching of 3 of her friends who owned a grocery store. And basically, in today's terms, they would be considered, being successful while Black, because they were rivaling a white-owned grocery store. And the owner really had a problem with that. So he figured out a way to create a situation where they could possibly be considered criminals, and were lynched as a result, we've heard this story so many different times, where Black people are defending themselves, but then framed as the aggressors and the perpetrators, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what happened with her friends. She realized that they were not guilty of any kind of crime whatsoever, and decided to start researching other lynchings that happened to find out how many other people were also innocent of any crime. So she went to specific locations where lynchings occurred and interviewed people to find out their side of the story. And she documented and chronicled names, dates, locations, excuses, and the brutal details of what happened regarding the lynchings. And she eventually compiled those information into pamphlets.
Wow. And can you talk about like I say, when we look at you talk about how we go from how our history is not told entirely, or we go from Reconstruction to Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. But what people failed to realize was that your great grandmother was the first person to refuse to give up her seat. Her movement to desegregate the rail cars preceded the Montgomery bus boycott. Could you talk about that, please?
Yes, well, my great grandmother was riding the train. She had to commute between Memphis and Woodstock to get to her job. And in the state of Tennessee, they had passed segregation law, Jim Crow laws. And my great grandmother decided she just was going to ignore them because what I understand is that they were not enforced on any regular basis. So she was riding the ladies' car and was asked to leave and go to the colored car, which doubled as a smoking car. And it was also mixed gender, and people were drunk and smoking in that car. They were absolutely separate and unequal. And when she was forcibly removed, she decided that she was going to sue on the basis of the cars being separate and unequal. She initially won on that basis, and it was very clear that the cars were separate and unequal. But then the train company decided to appeal the case, and they appealed it all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and it was overturned.
Wow. You know, in looking at that legislation and the political climate, then you kind of you draw a great comparison between President Woodrow Wilson and President Trump. Would you kind of compare those two legacies? Well, that may not be the right word, but those two experiences.
Well, Woodrow Wilson his policies were racist. He advocated for the resegregation of the federal government, which, at that point that things had been segregated, had been integrated. And the federal government was one of the few employers where African Americans could actually do pretty well, make a reasonable living. And under Woodrow Wilson, he decided to resegregate the federal government. And my great grandmother went to the White House and actually talked to him about that, and like, what are you doing? Why are we going backwards? And she also talked to him about instituting anti-lynching legislation, which we are still waiting in 2021 to actually be a reality. And he also famously screened Birth of a Nation, which was a groundbreaking cinematic film that was very strong in showing stereotypes, horrific stereotypes of Black people.
Wow. Something else that was just unique, like I said, I think one thing that your book does is that, we see Miss Wells as an activist, as one for civil rights, but we also kind of learn who she is as a woman. And you describe her as one that lived her life according to her own terms. Could you tell us how she lived her life according to her own terms, and how and how she kind of challenged the whole idea of what Black womanhood was supposed to look like during that time in history?
Right. Well, that's one thing about my great grandmother that I always sought out to connect with. As a descendant of hers, of course, I grew up hearing all of her amazing achievements from a professional standpoint and from an activist standpoint, and and that made her seem like almost intimidating, especially when people have these attitudes that you're supposed to live up to this legacy, right? And so I always wanted to know, well, what was she like as a human being, as a woman, outside of the resume? And so for me, I really sought out what was her emotional side? How did she handle different setbacks or disappointments, or did she ever feel afraid? Or, that's what I wanted to know about her. And that's what I wanted to incorporate in the book, because hopefully, people will be able to connect with her as a real woman, as a whole, fully fleshed human being, multidimensional, if they understand that she also struggled at times in defining herself. She kept a diary in her mid-20s, and that was very apparent when you read through the diary that she was struggling on this sort of journey of how to fit in to societal expectations of women, and for her as a Black woman, so she's dealing with racism and sexism, and just all of the sort of confinement that women were living under during her time. It was really not easy, and I hope that people get from my book her internal struggle and how she decided to just say, screw it, I'm just going to be me.
And what's so interesting too, what also makes her, even more relatable to all of us is that, here we are in the middle of a global pandemic with a virus that, that's running rampant through the world. People are becoming casualties of it. She lost, most of her family to a yellow fever that ran, it was a epidemic, it was in Memphis and Mississippi. Yeah, so would you talk about her, would you talk about that and how, she assumed the role of caring for her siblings?
Right. Well, when she was the oldest of 8 children. Unfortunately, one of her siblings died in infancy, so there were 7 children left. And when Ida was 16 years old, she was visiting her grandmother. So she was away from the rest of her family. She was visiting her grandmother on a farming area outside of Holly Springs. And unfortunately, both of her parents and one of her younger siblings died during that epidemic. So that left Ida with 5 younger siblings. And she decided to take it upon herself to become the breadwinner and the caregiver of her 5 siblings, because she didn't want them to be separated.
Mm-hmm. You've done a really, you and your was your grandmother and your mother, I mean, your family has done a really good job of preserving her legacy. Would you talk about some of the things that you've done to keep her legacy alive?
Yes, well, going through the generations, my grandmother was Ida's youngest daughter, her youngest child, and she edited and got Ida's autobiography published. And it took her decades to get that done. So that was a really major achievement that happened in 1970. Mm-hmm. And then my father is one of 5 children of my grandmother, and all 5 of them founded Ida B. Wells Memorial Foundation in 1988 to preserve, promote, and protect the legacy of my great-grandmother. And they were involved in various projects, provided a lot of support to other people who were doing major work to help remember her story. And then my generation, there are 15 of us grandchildren, a total of 20 great-grandchildren, and we've been active. We've preserved the foundation, and then I personally have been involved in a lot of public history projects, as well as writing articles, books, and working on films.
Wow. For the viewers that are tuning in, what advice would you give them about keeping their family stories alive and making sure that their history is, their personal individual history and stories are not lost?
Well, I always encourage people to obviously, interview every family member you can find who's willing to talk. And, these days, everybody, on your cell phone or whatever, you can record the stories. Also, any kind of documents. I mean, people need to understand that, documents like marriage certificates, death certificates, mortgages, like any kind of documents that you have, government documents, preserve them, make copies. and just encourage people to talk about their stories and document them as much as you can. In our family, I have more than one family member. In our family, we've created little books actually to write down our family tree and write stories, even memories. Yeah, all those things are helpful.
Okay. Wow, wow, wow. So, so tell us what is one thing, when you began this journey of writing this book about your great grandmother, what was one thing that you learned about her that you did not know?
The main thing that I learned about her that I did not know growing up was that she was surveilled by the FBI.
Oh, wow.
I knew that she was considered militant and radical and difficult and outrageous and all kinds of other names that people can come up with, women who have very strong personalities. But I didn't know that she actually had been surveilled by the FBI. So that was surprising. And in a way, it was affirming to me that she was that powerful, that she had that level of influence to the point where she was considered dangerous by the government.
Wow. And what is one thing that still remains a mystery to you about your great grandmother? One thing something that you're dying to find out and know that you haven't been able to.
I mean, as I said earlier, one of the things that I always sought out to find, and I'll never be able to, is what does she do to relax? I mean, she was, taking on the world and, working tirelessly for justice and equality. She was taking on systems, truth telling to power and, organizing different organizations and participating in, encouraging boycotts and all of these things that she was doing, plus raising 4 children, as well as being a wife. I mean, there was just, how many jobs is that, right?
Wow.
And so I always wondered, like, did she ever relax?
And she ran for political office. I was just, I was surprised. She ran also for the United Council for, it was Colored Women, and she ran against Mary McLeod Bethune. I thought that was interesting. Did they have any conflict? Were they on different ideological waves?
I mean, I can only gather by what my great grandmother documented as far as her interaction with Mary McLeod Bethune. And she didn't really go into very much detail when it came to that. But I'm sure they had a lot in common, since Mary McLeod Bethune was an educator. And she also obviously was involved in, the advancement for women. And they were both part of the National Association of Colored Women. So their lives overlapped. But my great grandmother did not go into a lot of detail when it came to how much they interacted.
Now, like I say, as being a woman in her era that kind of, did things on her own terms, would you talk about her marriage and your great grandfather?
Yes, well, that's one thing. Another thing I would like to know more information about, because she doesn't really go into very much detail at all about exactly how they met or they obviously started courting or dating, whatever term you want to use. And they obviously were enamored with each other. But what she does talk about is how he proposed to her more than once. um, and she was busy. She was doing an international speaking tour in England, and then she did a year-long tour in the United States. And that whole time he waited for her, and they had exchange of letters, which I wish I had copies of. But they were very well suited, and I got that from my grandmother. My grandmother did a lot of interviews, so I read transcripts of her interviews in order to get the information for Ida B. the Queen. And apparently my great grandfather Ferdinand was very easygoing, soft-spoken, sort of mellow kind of guy. And Ida was the exact opposite. She was a spitfire and very strong-willed and very opinionated. And so they really complemented each other.
Would you talk about what it means to you to be a descendant of Ida B. Wells and how that has shaped your identity? How that has shaped your identity?
I mean, the thing about my experience growing up in this family is that there are actually a lot of us. And I mean, like I said, I'm one of 15 grandchildren. I've lost count of how many that people are after my generation. There's just a lot of us. Plus, I have a mother's side of the family, which is large. So I grew up being influenced by a lot of different people. I always knew that Ida was my great grandmother, and her daughter, my grandmother, would talk about her mother, but we never felt any pressure to live up to, you know, the achievements of my great grandmother. It was more grounded in possibilities and in values versus pressure.
And what were some of those values?
Oh, well, education was very, very strongly encouraged, like almost not an option for all of us to go to college, to always speak up for ourselves and to believe that our voice is important, to, you know, like I said, stand up for ourselves and not be intimidated by anybody, but also realize that everybody is important. So my grandmother would always tell us, like, everybody you meet knows something you don't know. So don't think that you know everything. So my grandmother was very much about, like, you know, just be your best, but also be humble.
Wow. Would you tell us how Miss Wells, how she enriched and challenged the suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement?
Right. Well, the suffrage movement was very complex, and luckily that story is starting to be more well known. As far as you know, up until this point, I think most people thought of the suffrage movement as maybe 5 women. And we could rattle off the names, but we're all white. And so the idea that Black women were involved in the suffrage movement is starting to become more well known. The women during that time were not necessarily welcome in the predominantly white suffrage clubs. And Black women specifically had a different strategy when it came to fighting for the right to vote in the suffrage movement than white women did, because they looked at it as a multi-directional, multi-issue prong lens, versus white women were laser beam focused on gaining the right to vote, period. Versus Black women formed their own clubs, like the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and were focused on education and housing and you know, fair wages, and all incorporated into gaining the right to vote. And so their focus was on gaining the right to vote in order to impact policies that were oppressive to Black people. So it was just a different strategy.
Would you identify some Ida B. Wells contemporaries?
Well, yes, I mean, I incorporated in Ida B. the Queen as many ties as I could think of that would be reasonable to people who are current and people who have come before her, I mean, after her. So for instance, Malcolm X, you know, was surveilled by the FBI, as well as, you know, several other people that we are well, you know, that are well known. Today, we have people like Stacey Abrams and Lucy McBath, who are impacting legislation and impacting voter rights. We have Maxine Waters, who has no problem speaking truth to power and speaking the truth. So there are a lot of people that I incorporated that are continuing on with the work that she did. Bree Newsome, Colin Kaepernick, Kamala Harris.
And for some reason, I thought of Brian Stevenson, especially in light of the fact that one thing that many don't or know is that your great grandmother, I think her and your great grandfather, dealt with helped people who are falsely accused of crimes get out of legal trouble.
Exactly. Yes. And I incorporated a couple of those cases in the book to show how my great grandparents worked together as a team. He was an attorney, and he could put together briefs and cases, and then my great grandmother was the one that would go and testify, on behalf of some of these people who were being accused or even imprisoned on false accusations. And so, in addition to trying to affect policy, that would impact all Black people, my great grandparents together worked on advocacy for individual people.
Wow.
So they really were in the trenches.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, we want this discussion to be interactive. So if any audience members, if you have any questions for Ms. Duster, this is your opportunity. We will unmute you and invite you to turn on your camera and go live. Is there anybody that has any questions for Ms. Duster? Well, while we're waiting on that, we talked about the work that you and your family have done to preserve your great grandmother's legacy. Would you talk about the Ida B. Wells Museum in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and some of the landmarks in Chicago that commemorate her?
Right. Well, the Ida B. Wells Barnett Museum in Holly Springs, Mississippi, is actually the house that my great-great-grandparents were enslaved. My great-great-grandfather, Ida's father, and her mother worked there. He was a carpenter and she was a cook. And it's just so fortunate that the executive director of the museum was able to get the rights to that house. And so when people go to visit Holly Springs, Mississippi, they are literally in this space where Ida grew up. And our family foundation, gives a lot of support to the museum. But there are other, there's been a lot of activity in Chicago, because actually Ida lived in Chicago for 35 years versus she lived in Holly Springs for about 20 years. And then she lived in Memphis for about 10 years. She was all over the place. So there are a lot of,
I'm sorry.
Just really quickly, in Chicago, we have Ida B. Wells Drive, we have there are a couple of markers, and then we're in the process of having a monument created. And the whole idea is to give multiple ways that people can learn about Ida B. Wells.
We're in the Netflix era where, we've never seen more biopics than ever before. We had, it was last year, there was a series done on Madam C.J. Walker. We just saw the one on Ma Rainey. And so one of the audience members wants to know if there was a biopic on Ida B. Wells, who would you want to portray her?
That's a really hard question for me to answer, because I think there are so many talented people in Hollywood that would do a great job. So I think it would depend on what age would be depicted, because she did live to be 68 years old. Okay. But I think there are a lot of people that could do a good job.
So you can't think of one?
I would select myself.
Yes. Wow.
I'm just kidding.
Well, and if you look at I personally think you look a lot like her. So you would definitely be able to pull that off. But if a biopic was done about her, what would you want the thesis to be? What would you want the message? What would you want the film to hone in on?
I think The biggest thing about my great grandmother's life, which I hope people get from this book, is how much of a difference one person can make.
Okay.
And how being true to yourself is so important. She worked alone at times and was willing to work alone, which I think is important for people to, if you have strong convictions, you should be willing to stand by them. She also organized. She used writing as a form of activism in order to expose the injustice that was happening at her time. So she used her voice and her organizing skills, you know, in order to do almost all the work that she did.
Awesome. Well, like I said, we're getting ready to conclude our conversation. So I want to, submit to anybody, any of the viewers, if you live in the state of Delaware, if you Facebook message us, we're happy to send you a free complimentary copy of the book. And you're our third speaker in our series. Next week we will be featuring the iconic Lynn Whitfield. So we're delighted to host her. Miss Duster, it's been an honor and privilege. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you everybody for tuning in. Just one moment before we close, does anybody have any questions for Miss Duster? Okay. Well, thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you so much, Miss Duster. It's been an honor and a privilege.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.